Welcome to our fourth lecture of the semester, the end of the first full week of classes for the spring semester 2021, and we will conclude our first full week together with a further discussion on the American West and how that landscape changes and gets developed over the course of the second half of the 19th century, particularly the later decades of the century. On Wednesday, we discussed the concept of manifest destiny and westward expansion, the idea held by a certain group of Americans in the first half of the century about America's divine right as a nation, their destination from a providential standpoint was to acquire Western territories and expand to be this large, sprawling country, I should say, that spans from coast to coast across the entire continent of North America. We also looked at some of the conflicts that emerged as a result of this growth, primarily between white settlers who moved in droves to the West as a part of the Homestead Act and their encounters with Native American tribes that had been living in the West for decades and decades. So we will pick up there today and look at some additional conflicts that emerged as a result of this sudden transformative population growth in the region with these different groups of people that are living there, in addition to the white settlers and the Native Americans. You'll recall on Wednesday we discussed the Exodusters, the group of African Americans that left the South in droves to find their fortunes out west, particularly in the state of Kansas and some of the other neighboring Great Plains states. And by the end of by the start of the 1890s, there were more than 500,000 people, 520,000 plus African Americans living out west. So that's on the agenda for today's lecture to close out week one of the semester. And without further ado, we will talk about assimilation. We mentioned the Indian Wars the other day, or I mentioned the Indian Wars the other day, I should say, and the military conflicts and skirmishes between the Native Americans that lived out west, as well as the U.S. military and the white settlers that were coming west in the decades that immediately followed the Civil War. In the final decades of the 19th century, the federal government tries to find some way for these groups of people, particularly the white settlers and the Native Americans, to live peacefully together, or at least coexist peacefully together. And the way that they thought they could accomplish that goal was through assimilation. And what they really wanted to do was bring Native Americans into the fold, introduce them to white culture, or the culture of white America, and get them to pick up the habits, pick up the characteristics of white American culture, and begin to live by those norms and social mores and business practices, and gradually help them transition from Native life to white American life. So that was the goal of assimilation. And this took many forms. They had many ideas for how to accomplish this goal. How do we bring Native Americans into white America and get them to act, dress, conduct themselves, and basically believe in the values of white America as it appeared in the late 19th century. One of the first techniques they tried was cultural re-education. In this case, Christian missionaries, mainly women, went out west and sought to break down the social units within Native American tribes and institute new social units that mirror white Protestant America. So what do I mean by that when I say social units? I'm talking about the tribe as a whole, but also individual families within that tribe, the family unit, the household, if you will. And Native Americans, many Native American tribes, although not all of them, operated on a matrilineal social hierarchy. That means that women pretty much stood at the top of the social ladder, if you will, within many of these Native American tribes. It's a stark contrast from white America at this time, where white men stood at the top of the social chain. But with matrilineal societies, women performed much of the labor that men did in white family units. Much of the hunting and gathering and outdoorsy type work to subsist were handled by women, or at least women assisted men in doing this, depending on the tribe. And women served as the head of household, in effect, for many social units within tribes where matrilineal societies were in place. And the ancestry of the families, particularly the ancestry of the offspring, was determined through the mother's family line, the women's family line. Again, that's directly at odds, directly opposite, I should say, of what we see in Protestant white America at this time, which is existing on the East Coast and within the families of the white settlers on the West Coast. So these Christian missionaries tried to flip the script, if you will, tried to break down these social hierarchies and replace them with a new social hierarchy within the family units and within the tribes as a whole that would allow men to be at the forefront, men to be the primary decision makers, men to be the individuals doing most of the work outside the house, whereas women would handle the household chores and duties and keep house, for lack of a better term. Again, that was what was prevalent throughout much of white America at that time, and they were trying to persuade, coax the Native American matrilineal tribes to adopt a similar type of family structure and tribal structure as far as decisions made by tribal elders. So that was one way in which the federal government and white settlers tried to assimilate Native Americans into white America lifestyle, white America culture at the time. Another way was to concentrate on children, figuring that if they could get children to adjust to white American life, then that would spread to the family unit as a whole, and also spread down to future generations of Native Americans. And so the way that they did this was by setting up boarding schools specifically for Native American students. These were boarding schools in which the administrations and the faculty, the teachers were all white, but the students were all Native American, and they were trying to transform these Native Americans into something resembling a white American child. And they had policies to do this in terms of how they ran the school, operated the school on a daily basis. Some of these policies included English only language use during the school day, so Native American kids had to abandon perhaps their tribal language or tribal dialect and speak in English only, or communicate via speaking or writing explicitly in English. There were other policies and behavioral expectations that were in line with what you would find at schools in white America at this time, particularly with regards to physical appearance, clothing, attire, grooming, things of that nature. And the overall goal here is to take the children and get them to drop the savage culture, if you will, of their Native American tribes and introduce them and get them to adopt to the civilized culture of white America. Now, when I say that, that was the perception that that the school administrators and teachers and the white settlers had. They viewed Native Americans as savage and barbaric in their culture and their customs and their norms, whereas the white man and the white family was civilized. So that was their perspective, their viewpoint, and they were trying to get the Native children to abandon tribal customs, traditions, tribal clothing, tribal appearance, and tribal language in order to adopt the language of white America and the physical appearance and other customs of white America. And if you take a look in the right-hand corner, the upper right-hand corner of the slide here, this is an image from your textbook, from American Yop in chapter 17, and it gives you a specific example of a young Native American male student who entered the Carlisle Indian School, which is one of the more prominent Native American boarding schools of this era. The picture on the left is how he appeared when he entered the school for the first time, when he initially enrolled at the school in 1882. You can see he's wearing the regalia of his tribe, and wearing with the accessories such as the earrings of the tribe, and of course the long hair that was custom by male members of his tribe, and I believe he was from the Navajo Nation. And the picture on the right is the same individual, the same young male student, just 4 years later, as has concluded or is about to conclude his studies at the Carlisle Indian School. You see a marked contrast between the two images, as after 4 years in Carlisle Indian School, this young man dresses like a white American male of that time period, the late 1870s and 1880s in particular. And you can see the way that his hair is styled. First of all, his hair is obviously much shorter. It's combed in a way that is resembles, I should say, white men, young white gentlemen of the time period. And you can see he doesn't have the tribal necklace or the tribal earrings that he has in the first picture on the left there. And frankly, he looks quite a lot like a young gentleman of the Victorian era. He could have just as easily been a student at a boarding school on the East Coast, for example, at least in the physical appearance from what we see there. So that was sort of the goal. That's what they wanted to do by having these Native American children go into boarding schools, figuring that if they educated them in the ways and customs of white American society, that those children, once they finished their schooling, would bring that back to their tribes, perhaps influence their relatives, and then also perhaps raise their children in that sort of image. And that was one of the main goals of assimilation, along with the cultural re-education that I spoke of just a few minutes ago, about trying to transform tribes that operated on a matrilineal society to adopt a patriarchal or patrilineal society in terms of the social hierarchy of the tribe. Those were two of the main methods, if you will, for assimilation employed by the U.S. government, and especially by the white settlers that were in the West at the time, with regards to trying to get Native Americans to adopt white American culture. Another way in which the federal government specifically tried to convert Native Americans, or assimilate, I should say, Native Americans into white culture, came through actual federal legislation. The Dawes Severalty Act, passed in 1887, was a federal law that in many ways was designed to act as a homestead act for Native Americans. Not quite an apples to apples comparison there, but that was the general impact. If you remember from Wednesday's lecture, I spoke about the Homestead Act and how white settlers who were willing to move west after 1862, when the law went into effect, were able to file a claim on federal land and receive 160 acres of property. And then if they lived on that land and worked to improve the land, develop it agriculturally for 5 years, then they would own the land outright. And that was a boon to many people coming from the East to actually get an opportunity to become landowners. That was what the Homestead Act did. The Dawes Severalty Act was, again, designed to act in a similar way for Native Americans. The act provided Native Americans that were heads of their households, meaning heads of their family units, 160 acres of land, while unmarried Native American men would receive 80 acres of land through the Dawes Severalty Act. And the government would held the deeds in a trust for 25 years, while the Native Americans lived on and worked the land, worked to try to subsist out in the West, to feed themselves, as well as develop crops and agricultural business opportunities there. And if a Native American family stayed on the land for 25 years and did develop it, then after 25 years, they would receive ownership of the land, they would receive the deed, they would also officially become U.S. citizen at the time, so they'd gain both land and citizenship. An appealing offer, at least that's what the federal government thought when it provided, or the, I should say, the politicians that designed the law thought when they were passing it and putting it into existence. And the ultimate goal of the legislation was to continue to settle unoccupied Western land and to assimilate Native Americans into white America culture by extolling them on the virtues of farm life and agricultural life, basically implying that it was a good opportunity for them to pursue their goals and dreams by becoming a farmer, to make their livelihoods, I should say. Probably an easier way to say that, make farming their livelihood, and in the process practice the social norms and values of white America, thinking, hey, if these Native Americans take advantage of this and become stewards of the land, they'll help develop this land. They'll be able to sustain themselves with the business they can do, raising crops as well as feeding themselves on the land. And they will, in the process, realize the virtues of farm life and basically think, act, and conduct themselves the ways that the white American farmers did out west. It's sort of another way to assimilate Native Americans into the white American culture and have them absorb the high points, if you will, of white American farm life. In addition to giving opportunity to Native Americans to build their own individual homestead, if you will, the act also represented an attempt to break up Native American tribes. If each of these families were receiving 160 acres or 80 acres, if it was an unmarried Native American man, and were able to successfully develop this land and farm this land, then there would be, in the eyes of the federal government, at least the way that they thought, there would be no need for Native American tribes to continue to exist. These individual Native Americans would have their own families independent of a tribe. So it was basically an attack on Native American tribal sovereignty, and trying to get rid of sort of the group mentality, the group affiliation that comes with tribal membership, in favor of sort of a rugged individualism, if you will. That was one of the goals of the politicians that came up with the Dawes Act. That's what they thought would happen, and also they thought that if that did happen, not only would Native Americans become more like white Americans, but the federal government could stop providing subsidies to Native American tribes, Native American reservations, because they would no longer be needed. It was a way to fix or solve the Indian problem, the Native American problem, in the eyes of politicians and bureaucrats and even some members of the U.S. military out west, a way to solve a bunch of problems that had arisen when white settlers and the Indians had clashed in the various Indian wars that we talked about on Wednesday. So this was sort of a panacea, if you will. That's how they viewed the possibilities of the Dawes Severalty Act. In addition, the remaining land after the allotment was dispersed to Native Americans, any leftover land would then be sold to white settlers. So these white settlers could come buy the remaining plots of land, and that was a chance for the government to make some money and have more land developed out in the West. Unfortunately for the government, there were plenty of unintended consequences that emerged as a result of the Dawes Act. The combination of excess land sales to the white settlers and the prevalence of unscrupulous speculators who were doing whatever they could to swindle land from Native Americans in fraudulent business transactions prevented the Indians from really fully capitalizing on this newfound opportunity to become homesteaders. Consequently, Native Americans lost 86 million of the 130 million acres that had been allotted through the Dawes Act between 1887, when the act was passed and enacted, I should say, and 1934. And most of the acres that they lost were the most prime real estate, the best plots of land for either agricultural development or possibly even prospecting for other resources such as gold and the like. So there were plenty of good intentions behind the Dawes Act, but ultimately it was a failed policy, and the end result was that Native Americans lost plots of land, and the poverty became widespread and prevalent in amongst Native American reservations at this time. You can see in the upper right-hand corner here, this is an advertisement that ran in a newspaper of the era about the land that was available out west as a result of the Dawes Act. So this is a late 1880s advertisement imploring Native Americans to take advantage of the Dawes Act and create a homestead of their own, get a home of your own with several easy payments, and also an ad for white settlers to do the same with whatever leftover land remained. Now, we discussed the attempts at assimilation from the U.S. government with regards to Native Americans in the West. What I want to talk about now is the resistance to assimilation by the Native Americans. And this particularly unfolded at the end of the 1880s and into 1890. One of the primary forms of resistance was the ghost dance. In 1889, a Native American prophet, Wovoka of the Northern Paiute tribe in Nevada, experienced a vision, and in this vision he saw that the answer was for most of the problems plaguing the tribe, including the presence of white settlers, would dissipate or disappear if members performed the ghost dance and participated in the religious revival that was the ghost dance ceremonies. Wovoka's prophecy spreads to other tribes and sparked a pan-Indian movement, that is, a movement in which Native Americans of many different tribes began to adopt the ghost dance and perform the ghost dance and sort of just have these ceremonies, this religious revival ceremonies, Native American style, in which they communicated with spirits and things of that nature. One of the main problems of this era, as I've mentioned repeatedly, is the growing presence of white settlers on land that the Native Americans had lived on for years, and that is the case with the Lakota Sioux. The Lakota Sioux was a tribe that had lived in South Dakota for years and had owned the land in South Dakota, but South Dakota earned statehood in 1889, and after it became a new state, an influx of white settlers poured into the state. And in response to that influx of white settlers, the Lakota Sioux began to participate in the ghost dance and hold ghost dance ceremonies and revivals. This practice alarmed local Indian agents, meaning local agents of the Federal Indian Bureau, who began to arrest members of the Lakota Sioux tribe. In December of 1890, an attempt to arrest Chief Sitting Bull, along with several other members of the Lakota Sioux tribe, went awry, and Sitting Bull and several others were killed in this attempted arrest, and that sparked the Lakota Sioux to disperse into the wilderness and flee the U.S. military. A large contingent of the Lakota Sioux were eventually confronted by a U.S. cavalry unit a couple weeks after Sitting Bull's death in late December of 1890. The cavalry unit escorted this contingent of Lakota Sioux, I should say, to Wounded Knee Camp, and the following day a skirmish broke out, which ultimately resulted in the deaths of somewhere in the neighborhood of 150 to 300 Lakota Sioux tribe members, along with 24 cavalrymen. Historians don't know exactly how many Lakota Sioux members died in the Wounded Knee Massacre, but the massacre took place on December 29th, 1890, and it represents the last gasp, if you will, for Native American resistance. It is the end of organized Native American resistance to the federal government until the 1950s. And so that was how the conflicts between the white settlers and the Native American tribes out west, that's sort of how things ended as the 19th century came to a close, and we can tell from the Indian Wars that I mentioned in Wednesday's lecture, along with the attempts at assimilation and the subsequent resistance to assimilation, that there was certainly misunderstandings and conflict between Native American tribe members and white American settlers and the U.S. military during these final decades of the 19th century. Too often these conflicts led to bloodshed on both sides, but unfortunately the white settlers, backed by the federal government, ultimately were able to subdue the Native Americans into submission by the final decade of the 19th century. So I will close our lecture today with this and let you know that on Monday we will still be talking about the West, only this time we'll talk about economic development in the West and with regards to white settlers and individual ranchers and farmers and people like that versus corporate America. What happens when corporate America really gains a foothold out in the western states and the western territories in the late 19th century? There are conflicts that arise there, and as well as some innovations in economic development, particularly with regard to the transportation of goods across the continent. So we will delve into all of that in Monday's lecture, And that will wrap things up for today. I wish all of you a very happy and productive weekend ahead. And I'll talk to you again with our next lecture on Monday.